Okay, the two things I want to talk through in this review are condensation performance and livability. Let's talk about condensation performance first. The REI Flash Air 1 has two very small vents on either end. These are lower vents that draw in cool, dry air. And then one vent at the peak that allows warmer, moist air to escape. In addition, there's a large mesh panel in the front of the living area. That's what makes this a hybrid single double wall tent. So most of the rear and top of the tent are single wall, and most of the front is this hybrid double wall design. So this is where you have mesh and then this insulating space in the vestibule that's then protected by another layer of solid fabric. So you have opportunity for venting both in and out through that mesh panel as well. But when the tent is entirely closed up, you can draw cool, dry air in through the end vents and then through the underneath the front of the vestibule door and into the mesh panel that separates the living area from the vestibule. But if you have the vestibule fly rolled back, then you have this option for a huge vented wall. Now, obviously, you can't have this wall open during a rainstorm, but in conditions like today and last night where we had a nice, cool, dry night, then this provides plenty of ventilation to keep the tent dry under fair weather conditions. Now, just for kicks, I closed everything up last night. I closed the top vent, I closed the door, zipped everything up, and got buttoned in really tight. I'll share some temperature and humidity data with you. I use Kestrel drop sensors. I placed one on a tree near the tent to measure outside conditions, and then I hung one from the interior peak of the tent to measure conditions inside the tent. So as we went to bed last night, the temperature was 39 degrees and the humidity outside was less than 50, so somewhere around 45 or so. Inside the tent, as we went to bed and I got done changing clothes and kind of settled into my sleeping bag, the temperature stabilized to around 42 to 43 degrees and the humidity stabilized at around 65%. Now, as the night wore on, we saw a drop in outside temperature, a rise in relative humidity outside. And so the temperatures dropped to around 30 to 32 degrees and the outside humidity rose to about 65%. So what happened inside the tent when that outside temperature dropped and the outside humidity rose? So at that point, the inside temperature of the tent dropped to around 34. So you can see that there's only a couple of degrees of difference between the inside and outside temperatures of the tent. So don't expect this to be an insulating tent in the same way that a double wall tent is going to retain your body heat. Now, here's the interesting thing. When the temperature dropped, the humidity inside the tent rose significantly to 95 to 97%. That's the point at which condensation started to form quite a bit on the interior walls. There was always a really thin film early on in the night, but then at this point of the night, when the humidity inside the tent rose to 95+%, we started to get quite a bit of condensation in the form of actual visible drops of condensation inside the tent. This was a totally expected result. I would have expected this to be in any tent I would sleep in that had a fully enclosed perimeter, whether it was a pyramid or a single wall trekking pole tent or even a tarp with closed ends, for example. The only time I've seen condensation not form in these types of conditions on a full perimeter shelter is when that shelter is made of Dyneema composite fabrics. And that is because the emissivity of that fabric is so different from what we see in the silicone and polyurethane coated nylons and polyesters that condensation just doesn't form as much on a DCF shelter. Okay, let's walk through the next phase of the experiment I conducted last night, and that was at around 4:30 in the morning. I rolled the vestibule door all the way back so that not only was the front mesh wall exposed to the outside environment, but also that part of the roof of the REI Flash Air 1 that provides some overhead ventilation as well. And once I did that, as expected, humidity dropped down to about 70%, which was only a few percent higher than the outside humidity. And the interior temperature dropped to within 1 degree of the outside temperature. So we got this really good exchange of environment between the inside and the outside of the tent, which of course indicates that you have equilibrium as a result of adequate ventilation. Now, as the sun started to come up at around 6:30 or so, we saw this rise in temperature between 6:30 and 8 o'clock inside the tent go from 32 degrees, 34 degrees, up to 70 degrees as the sun started directly hitting the tent. Again, an expected result, especially since the sun came up the backside of my tent and hit that back nylon wall, and that really started to warm things up. Humidity dropped down to 20%, and by the time 7 o'clock rolled around and we're still looking at fairly high humidities, most of the condensation was gone. There was a few drops here and there, but for the most part, the tent was completely dry inside. In terms of wind, we had very little wind at the beginning of the night, and then sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I started to hear big gusts of winds up in the trees on the ridges that are surrounding us, but very little wind actually hitting our tent. We're kind of protected in this little copse of ponderosa pines here, and the wind that hit the tent was maybe 1 to 3 miles per hour. It's very, very light breezes. So I wouldn't expect a breeze like that to significantly impact the ventilation in the REI Flash Air 1, because the intake vents are either going to be on either end or through the front vestibule. And the wind that was hitting my tent last night came from the back wall, and there's no ventilation on that side of the tent. So as expected, I had condensation build up because I wasn't getting any benefit from the wind. It wasn't until I opened the vestibule doors, peeled the vestibule doors back so that as much mesh was exposed as possible, then that moist air left my tent through the mesh. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about is livability. Livability encompasses a couple different things. There's the footprint of the inner tent. There's the height of the ends of the inner tent, which is where your feet and head are going to be. There's the peak height in the middle of the tent, which is where you're going to be sitting up and doing tasks. There's the overall volume inside the inner tent, which defines the extent to which you can comfortably change clothes or shift positions or do some chores inside the tent. There's the access to and volume of the vestibule so that you can store gear in the vestibule and maybe perform chores in the vestibule, such as cooking. And so let's take a closer look at some of these livability details. First one I want to show you is the foot end of the tent, which is where this aluminum strut pull is. And this is where the foot of your sleeping bag should go. Now, we pitched our tents last night so that the vestibules faced each other, but we're on a bit of a slope here. So I actually slept with my head down at this end of the tent last night, which is about as bad as you can get in terms of condensation performance and headroom, because I was brushing my head against the tent whenever I had to get up. And this is not the ideal configuration, but it worked, and it wasn't, undue hardship to do that. But normally I would put my head down at the other end of the tent. This pull is here to give your sleeping bag a chance to stay off these walls so that if condensation does form, you're not going to get a lot of condensation on your sleeping bag. Now, if you are camping with a thick air pad, 2.5, 3 inches, and a thick down sleeping bag, something maybe in the range of a 10-degree bag, you're probably going to brush up against this roof line here, especially if you have big feet. Here's a profile view of the tent. You have this shallow slope down to the foot end and a steeper slope here at the head end. And that's why you want your head down at this end, because that gives you the ability to sit up from your laying down position and not have your head brush into the roof of the tent wall. So one thing of note of this tent is be careful where you pitch it, because you don't want your head down at that end. It will create more condensation. There's less opportunity for respiration, moist respiration, air to escape, and it's more comfortable because when you're getting up and down, then you're not bumping into that wall so much. So unlike a tent that has a symmetrical configuration like the Hilleberg Anon behind me, you really can only live in this tent adequately if your head is at the head end of the tent where the front wall is steep. So I'm not a big person. I'm 5 feet 7 inches tall, and I'm oriented in the tent in the proper position here. And as you can see, my head brushes up against that wall when I am laying down in the tent. And if I lay all the way down, you can see that I just barely touch that wall. Now, it's not a huge deal. unless the tent is absolutely dripping wet with condensation and you're camping in a very humid, wet environment, maybe it's raining, you're all buttoned up, then it's going to be a problem for you. But that problem is not unique to the REI Flash Air. It is unique to any tent this small and this short. But if you consider that the tent weighs 20 ounces and provides vastly more livability than a bivy sack, a hooped bivy sack at less weight, then this might be a really good option for you, especially if you mainly need it for protection from wind and bugs and things like that in dry climates or summertime conditions. And you're not going to have to spend a lot of time living in the tent. I could see this being a great choice for long distance hikers who spend most of their time on the trail versus in camp, or for hunters who just need a place to shack up before they get up at the crack of dawn and go on their hunt. This is an ultralight, minimalist shelter that functions very well for what it does, and that's providing you with shelter at minimum weight and a low cost. At $250, this is also cheaper than most high-end hooped bivy sacks on the market as well. Now, before I leave this review, I think we should talk about the larger version of this tent, which is the REI Flash Air 2. The Flash Air 2 is taller, wider, and has 2 entrances and 2 vestibules. This tent is a much more livable solution for one person at very little additional weight. So if you want a tent that's more livable, but still cost-effective and lightweight, take a look at the REI Flash Air 2. And then consider the Flash Air 1 if you want something that's more like a bivy sack, but more livable and more compact. Okay, that's it. Hope you enjoyed this first looks review and it provided you with some insight and value into the REI Flash Air 1 tent. Please check out the review that's linked in the description below. That review contains my comments on a variety of other issues related to this tent, including the quality of construction, the ease of setup, and its performance in wind, rain, and snow.